June 15, 2025 dawned over Tehran not with sunlight but with fire and chaos. The city, usually bustling with the sounds of morning life, was instead shaken awake by the thunder of explosions and the distant wail of sirens. In a matter of moments, the familiar skyline was transformed into a battlefield with flames licking the horizon and smoke blotting out the rising sun. Black smoke from burning oil depots choked the city, signaling the end of the shadow war between Iran and Israel. For years, both nations had traded blows in secret, but now the conflict had erupted into the open for all the world to see. The air was thick with the acrid scent of burning oil, and the streets were filled with confusion and fear. This was no covert operation. Israel had struck directly at Iran's economic heart. Fighter jets roared overhead, launching precision strikes on vital oil infrastructure, crippling a key pillar of Iran's economy. The message was clear. The era of deniable attacks was over. Hours later, Iran retaliated with equal ferocity, determined to show its own strength. Missiles streaked across the night sky toward Tel Aviv, sirens wailing as families rushed to shelters. The city, usually alive with nightlife, was plunged into darkness and panic. Parents clutched their children, huddling in stairwells and underground bunkers, praying for the barrage to end. Israel's Iron Dome intercepted many but not all. The defense system lit up the sky with bursts of light, each explosion a desperate attempt to shield the city below. Yet, the sheer volume of incoming missiles overwhelmed even the most advanced technology. Some missiles broke through, shattering the illusion of safety. Buildings trembled from the impacts, windows shattered, and fires erupted in residential neighborhoods. The sense of invulnerability that many Israelis once felt was gone in an instant. The conflict had exploded into open war, with civilians on both sides caught in the crossfire. In both Tehran and Tel Aviv, ordinary people found themselves at the mercy of forces far beyond their control. Emergency responders raced through the chaos, searching for survivors and tending to the wounded. Oil depots in Tehran burned, threatening Iran's economy, while Israeli emergency crews searched for survivors in the rubble. The economic and human costs mounted by the hour, with each new explosion deepening the crisis. Shock and fear gripped both nations, quickly hardening into anger and grim resolve. In the streets, people gathered, some to protest, others to demand vengeance, all united by a sense of loss and uncertainty about what the future would bring. The world watched, realizing the nightmare scenario was unfolding, a direct war between two regional powers with global consequences. Governments scrambled to respond, markets trembled, and millions held their breath, fearing the conflict could spiral even further out of control. The only question now, how much worse will it get, and who will pay the next price? As night fell once more, both cities braced for what tomorrow might bring, knowing that the world had changed forever in a single fiery dawn. The June 15th attacks marked the climax of a rapidly escalating cycle of hostilities between Iran and Israel, a conflict that had been simmering for months beneath the surface. Tensions had been mounting, with each side trading threats and covert blows, but on this night, the world watched as the situation exploded into open warfare. At precisely 2 a.m., under the cover of darkness, Israeli F-35 stealth fighters roared into the sky. Their mission, to carry out precision strikes on Iran's most vital oil and refinery complexes near Tehran and Isfahan. These facilities were not just economic lifelines for Iran, but also symbols of national pride and resilience. The aftermath was immediately clear. Satellite images released just hours later confirmed the devastation. Dozens of storage tanks and processing units lay in ruins, fires raging and smoke billowing into the sky. The economic and psychological impact was immense, sending shockwaves through the region. Simultaneously, Israel struck infrastructure near the highly sensitive Natanz nuclear facility. This was more than a military operation. It was a calculated message, a warning that Israel was willing to target Iran's most guarded assets if provoked further. This was a public, undeniable escalation. No more deniability, no more shadow war. The world could no longer pretend these were isolated incidents or accidents. Israel's message was unmistakable. The old rules of engagement no longer applied. The era of plausible deniability and covert operations was over. Iran's response was swift and massive. Within hours, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps announced Operation True Promise 2, unleashing a barrage of hundreds of missiles and drones aimed directly at Israeli territory. The scale and speed of the retaliation stunned observers worldwide. The attack targeted military bases, critical infrastructure, and even major cities, aiming to overwhelm Israel's advanced air defense systems. Sirens wailed across Tel Aviv and other cities as emergency crews scrambled to respond to the chaos. The shadow war that had defined the region for years was over. A hot, open war had begun. Explosions lit up the night sky, and the world watched in horror as the conflict spiraled out of control. The world now faced the terrifying reality of direct state-on-state conflict in the heart of the Middle East. Global leaders scrambled to respond, holding emergency meetings and issuing urgent calls for restraint. The stakes had never been higher. Every decision, every strike now carried the risk of a wider regional or even global war. As the dust settled, civilians in Tehran and Tel Aviv watched the news in fear and uncertainty. Streets emptied, military vehicles patrolled, and the entire region braced for what would come next, a future more uncertain than ever before. Israel's strike on Iran's oil depots was a bold gamble, targeting the lifeblood of Iran's economy. Over 40% of Iran's export capacity was knocked offline, fires raging and threatening both exports and domestic supply. The goal: cripple Iran's ability to fund its military and proxies and force Tehran to focus inward. Strikes near Natanz sent a chilling message: Israel could hit Iran's nuclear ambitions at will. This was more than economic warfare, it was a direct challenge to the regime's power. Israeli leaders believed only force could halt Iran's nuclear and regional ambitions. The risk: escalation into a far wider, more destructive war. Beyond strategy, the war's human cost is devastating. In Tehran, toxic smoke forced thousands to flee, hospitals overflowed with the injured, and families mourned lost loved ones. Iranian state media reported dozens dead and many more wounded at the oil depots. In Israel, a missile struck an apartment block in Rishon LeZion, killing 7, including children, and leaving a community shattered. Daily life in both countries collapsed, schools closed, gas lines grew, and fear became constant. The psychological toll is immense, hardening attitudes and making peace seem distant. Casualties mount: over 30 dead in Iran, 15 in Israel, hundreds injured. But numbers can't capture the trauma or the families torn apart. For those living through it, survival and hope are all that remain. The war is no longer about politics, it's about enduring the unimaginable. Iran's missile barrage was a calculated show of force, mixing old and new weapons to overwhelm Israel's defenses. Israel's Iron Dome, Arrow, and David Sling intercepted most threats, but some missiles broke through, causing real damage and terror. Strikes hit civilian areas and military sites, proving Iran's arsenal is a real threat. For Israelis, the war was now at their doorstep, shattering faith in absolute security. Iran's improved missile precision and Israel's defensive prowess set the stage for a deadly technological arms race. Each side now races to outpace the other, knowing the next attack could be even bigger. The balance between offense and defense has never been more precarious. As missiles fell and sirens wailed, leaders in both countries took to the airwaves, their words as fierce and calculated as their military actions. The world watched as the conflict played out not just on the battlefield, but in the battle for hearts and minds. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu stood before the cameras, his tone resolute. He declared that Israel would do whatever was necessary to defend itself, warning Iran of severe and immediate consequences. His message was clear: Israel would not hesitate to act, no matter the cost. In Tehran, officials responded with equal intensity. They vowed that Israel's strategic error would not go unanswered, promising that any further aggression would be met with even greater force. Their rhetoric was defiant, painting Iran as a nation unwilling to back down. Both sides framed themselves as defenders, Israel against what it called an existential threat, Iran against what it saw as foreign aggression and interference. Each government portrayed its actions as necessary, justified, and even heroic in the eyes of their people. Israel insisted its strikes were preemptive, forced by Iran's nuclear ambitions and the growing influence of regional proxies. Officials argued that waiting would only increase the danger, and that decisive action was the only way to ensure national security. Iran, meanwhile, claimed its nuclear program was entirely peaceful, a right under international law. Iranian leaders painted Israel as the true aggressor, acting as a tool of Western imperialism and seeking to destabilize the region for its own benefit. Each side's rhetoric hardened public opinion at home, fueling anger and fear. In living rooms and public squares, citizens rallied behind their leaders, convinced that compromise was not only unlikely, but perhaps even a betrayal. The world saw two irreconcilable narratives, each fueling the cycle of violence and mistrust. International media amplified these messages, making the conflict seem even more intractable and urgent. For Israel, the conflict is about survival, a fight to protect its people and its future. For Iran, it is about sovereignty, dignity, and resistance against what it perceives as external threats and domination. The war of words is as relentless as the war on the ground. Every statement, every speech, becomes another weapon in a conflict where perception is as important as firepower. With every speech and every accusation, the path to peace grows narrower. Diplomatic efforts falter as leaders double down on their positions, unwilling to show weakness or make concessions. The world listens, anxious and divided, but the gulf between the two sides only widens. Hopes for dialogue fade as the rhetoric escalates, leaving the international community searching for answers. The stakes are existential for both nations. In this war of rhetoric, every word matters, and every word brings the region closer to the brink. The conflict's shockwaves hit global markets instantly. Oil prices soared over 15%, stoking fears of a major supply disruption as Iran's exports and the Strait of Hormuz came under threat. Higher oil costs rippled worldwide, driving up fuel prices and inflation, while stock markets plunged. World leaders scrambled to urge restraint, fearing a wider war could trigger a global recession and refugee crisis. The UN called an emergency session, but divisions hampered action. The risk of regional escalation, drawing in Hezbollah, US forces and others, grew by the hour. The world's economy and security now hung in the balance. Diplomacy became a desperate race against catastrophe. June 2025's open warfare was years in the making. Since 2023, Iran's nuclear advances and Israel's covert attacks fueled a tit-for-tat spiral. Iran armed proxies and harassed shipping, while Israel struck missile bases and assassinated key figures. Both sides escalated, each convinced the cost of inaction outweighed the risk of war. The shadow war's fragile boundaries finally shattered. Now, the region faces the consequences of years of brinkmanship. The path to open conflict was paved by fear, pride, and mutual distrust. The world stands at a crossroads, the risk of all-out regional war higher than ever. Israel faces pressure to strike back harder, risking a cycle of escalation with no end. Iran could activate Hezbollah or close the Strait of Hormuz, dragging in the US and others. Diplomats scramble for a ceasefire, but mistrust runs deep and time is running out. The alternative to diplomacy is a war that would devastate both nations and destabilize the world. The anger and grief in Tehran and Tel Aviv fuel calls for vengeance, not peace. The forces unleashed may be impossible to contain. As the smoke clears, one question remains: is there a way back from the brink? The world holds its breath, hoping for peace, fearing the abyss. The next move could decide the fate of a generation.